All right, so we're recording. Don't say anything embarrassing, or it will be forever preserved on the internet. Right. Some of you have either emailed me or even come to me and asked about the geography quiz. You should be worried about this, right? It is a daunting task, I think, for many of you who did not get an education in geography at any point in your life, right? It's not your fault necessarily. I might recommend this website, okay, Satera.com, and it's set up so even without a membership, you can create all sorts of geography quizzes, right? Just as an example, here is a Europe rivers quiz, and you can actually go in and change this and take rivers out that aren't on the the list of things to be examined and stuff like that, right? So, click on the Thames, there it is. Click on the Oder, well, that's this one. Click on the, no, that was wrong. That's that. All right, that's embarrassing. Click on the Dnieper, that's wrong. Okay. Click on the Vistula. Okay, there we go. Anyway, some of the Eastern European rivers I know a little better than others, obviously. And I was trying to do that on the fly. So, in any case, right, you can do this, and this will help you to learn the geography. And I know I've given you the impression I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, which is really embarrassing. But you still need to know that whether I did badly in that little 2-minute demonstration or not. Okay. And I would challenge any of you to do geography. If you get better score than I do, then we can talk about it. One thing I want, let's do it. Okay. Any questions about that? So the quiz is next time. It's Thursday. All right. That's the first take. Okay. There will be another take. Given that, well, I think it's a week later. All right. I have to look at the syllabus. You got 2 chances at this. You keep the higher of your 2 scores. You are not penalized for taking it a second time and getting a worse score. All right. It's whichever one you do better. Okay. So please be prepared for that. All right. So I want to start our class today by talking about prehistory. I have no idea what it is. Prehistory. What does that mean? What is prehistory?
Period of time where we didn't have something either written or
Okay. All right. So there is this marker, right? There are certain developments where we move from prehistory to history. You hear this used much more by archaeologists than you do by historians. Okay. They might talk about examining a particular people or a particular area in prehistoric time versus historic time, right? And as Gabe rightly points out, the important marker there is the development of writing. Okay? So once we have writing, we identify a people, a society, a civilization as being in historical time or in history. Right? Now that doesn't mean, from a different definition, that there wasn't history before that. How long have human beings graced the face of this earth? Or we might say curse the face of this earth. Maybe you have your hand up there, or you just like holding your pen. Yeah, that's fine. Andy, go ahead.
No, this year it could go either way.
This year it could go either way. Yeah, the blessed or the gracing or the cursing. Yeah. We're forever going to refer to. The 2020 is going to become a metaphor, right? We will refer to something instead of using an acronym like FUBAR, we'll simply say 2020. Right. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, so this whole situation is 2020, right? It's no longer hindsight is 2020. We don't want to be associated with 2020 in any way. Okay. For those of us who still have to live 4 months of this year, God bless us all, right? Okay, anyway. we get distracted. So there is this important moment, right, where history happens. But how long again have human beings been around? Yeah. Yeah, something like that. I mean, it depends on what we call a human being. If we want to talk about certain hominids, we go back as far as maybe 7 million years ago. Okay. Homo sapiens, somewhere between 500,000 and 250,000 years ago. And, with the development of the ability to speak, sometime sooner than that, maybe 50,000 years ago to 100,000 years ago. Right? But it wasn't until when the human beings began writing things down. Do you have a sense of when that happened? About how long have we been doing this? There's no penalty for guessing how long. Yeah. Okay, it's actually a little less than that. What about, yeah? Well, it's about 4,000 BCE. Yeah. Okay, so it's about 6,000 years ago. The human beings began writing. Okay. Now that doesn't mean it happened everywhere at once. There were places on this earth that didn't start writing until just a few hundred years ago. Most of the human populations in what we now call North America, for instance, did not have writing systems. Right? Most of the human societies in sub-Saharan Africa, there were exceptions, but some of them did not. Right? That doesn't mean they didn't have an interesting society and culture and a kind of momentum of their own. In other words, that they didn't have a history used a different way, right? Not with reference to writing, but with reference to things that happened among human societies. But it's just more difficult to know what happened, right? Why is writing so important for the study of history?
Because you have first-hand information about the text.
Okay.
Something that really you can preserve over time.
Yeah, good. Carolyn? Right. And often writing is done, not always, and maybe not even the majority of the time. But writing tends, more than other forms of preserved evidence, to be purposeful. People write things down for a specific reason that they want to be preserved. Okay. Maybe for only a short time, right? If you write, well, nobody writes letters anymore, okay? But imagine you lived like 50 years ago, right? Before email, before texting, before social media and all of that. You might write a letter to someone with the anticipation that that would last long enough at least to get to them and be read. And depending on who it was, you might hope that they kept this thing, right? You write a love letter to your beloved, you would hope that he or she would keep that thing forever, cherish it, put it in a special box or tie it up with a ribbon or something like that, okay? So there is an intent to preserve that comes with writing. Now that's not always the case, right? My children write things all the time. They make little drawings, they compose little poems, they, do whatever they can do with their newfound skills. And they hand it to their parents, and their parents give them a smile or a hug or whatever, and then often, within a few hours, that thing goes in the trash because it's not necessarily worth preserving. Yes, I'm sorry, parents do throw kids' things away, right? Though some of them do get kept. Okay. So not everything gets kept, and the further back in the record you go, the less there is, as a general rule, right? But writing is important for all of these reasons. Okay? Any other comments on writing or thoughts about writing and why this is vital? So how do we know about human beings who lived before 6,000 years ago, or before the advent of writing in whatever society we're talking about, whatever area of the world we're talking about? Yes?
Archaeology.
Yeah, people leave things behind. And depending on the material those things are made out of, they might get preserved, right? If this is a more durable material like stone, or or metal, and if it's kept in an environment, if it ends up someplace where the environment is conducive to the survival of that piece of whatever it is, the material remain, right, then this thing can be preserved almost indefinitely. But this often doesn't have an accompanying explanation of what it means. Take this as an example. Anybody seen this before? Carolyn, what is this? Okay.
It's
Right. So these, and this is not unique. There are actually a lot of little figurines like this. This thing's about 5 inches tall. Okay. A lot of little figurines like this that have been found actually in different parts of the world. This one happened to be found in what is now Europe, in a place called Willenburg in Germany, or Austria. It's from about 25,000 years ago. Okay. Give or take. What is this thing? And maybe more importantly, what does it tell us about the people who made it? So let's go for the obvious here. This is a little figurine of what? A woman. Okay, hopefully that's obvious here, right? What did the sculptor think was important in the portrayal of the feminine form? All right. Yeah, the breasts and the genitalia. Okay. Well, yeah, and the corpulence of the figure is rather obvious. Now, why? That is maybe the most important question you will ask about every piece of evidence that you encounter this semester or in your study of history for more life. Why? Why did this happen? Why did they portray a woman like this?
Is it some kind of like idiot facility goddess?
Okay. Probably, right? How do you jump from, as she has, large breasts and obvious genitalia to this idea of a fertility cult?
Well, considering the size usually means an excess of some kind of material, usually food.
Right. Yes, yeah.
So,
you have to eat a lot
yeah.
to look like this. Okay. Does this reflect reality, do you think? Did women who lived as hunter-gatherers, which is how human beings lived at this point in time, and in fact for most of the existence of human beings, we have lived as hunter-gatherers. It's only in the last, well, at most in some societies 10,000 years ago, where we turned to a different way of life. Okay. Did hunter-gatherer women look like that? Yeah.
I think no, because arms
All right. I mean, to non-existent. Are there arms? No, they're like over the huge breasts, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And like I feel like doing all that.
Okay. Yeah, because hunter-gatherers move around a lot. They get exercise. They walk. I think the hunter-gatherer diet is able to sustain a figure like this, or produce a figure like this in the first place. Well, actually, you'd be surprised. We'll talk about that in a minute here. Okay. Hunter-gatherers actually ate fairly well, maybe far better than we would give them credit for. Right? Yeah.
But we lack some context of why really what they do. So I think we don't really know if it's a human or not. So it's very easy.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. We lack context. So we need to think about what human beings were doing 25,000 years ago in what is now Germany, and extrapolate from there, perhaps, why they would choose to make something like this out of a piece of stone that was meant to be kept, it seems. How easy is it to chip something out of stone? Anybody sculpted in stone before? Right? It's not very easy, okay? Even to get, the level of detail here, which granted is not that great compared to later works of art, right? But this is not something you could produce in 10 minutes, probably, depending on how skilled you were. It's going to take some definite skill, some learning, maybe some trial and error to produce a figure. In other words, somebody had to put in time to do this. Okay? So why is it worth preserving a little statue, or making in the first place a little statue that represents a female figure that no one likely ever saw? You probably never saw a woman who looked like this. What does that tell us about what they value, what they thought was important? Comment?
I was just gonna say, like, from a psychology point, like, why are they thinking that?
That's exactly the question. Why are they thinking this? Now, if this is something to do with a form of religion, which is a real possibility here, right? That still leaves us with the question, why would it, so in other words, if this is not a human being, if this is a goddess of some sort, right? Why would they portray a goddess with a human form that doesn't look like anything the human forms they actually saw look like? Okay?
Maybe they thought that a goddess would be, I don't know, like the ideal look, and I guess someone that's that size is definitely well fed, and everyone just wants to be well fed.
Excellent. Okay. This seems to be an expression of an ideal. Right? In a world where people were consumed with the act of obtaining food, where if they didn't find food, they faced the very real prospect of death, right? You don't find food as a hunter-gatherer, well, that means you're going to be weaker the next day when you go out to try to find food, and thus perhaps less likely to find food. And the longer you go without food, the weaker and weaker you get, and the less likely you will be to survive, especially if you come up against some sort of danger. Desperation might drive hunter-gatherers to attack animals that are far more dangerous, perhaps, than they're equipped to handle. And I'm just speaking hypothetically here, right? What we know about hunter-gatherers is they probably rarely faced the prospect of starvation. All right, they were skilled enough and knowledgeable enough to be able to find food. Okay. But they almost certainly didn't look like this. And they definitely prized having enough, or maybe even an abundance of food. And so they thus would have portrayed, or did portray, as we see, the female form, the ideal female form, like this. We might even suggest that this is the hunter-gatherer's version of beauty. She's a hottie. All right. Dave, do you have another comment? Sorry, hard one to follow up, but you don't. Okay. Why is there no face? Yeah.
Could also be a part of religion.
Yeah, it could be.
Simply a faceless God.
Yeah, potentially. Any other possible explanation? Yeah, maybe they just don't care, right? The face isn't important. No matter what she looks like in facial features. She might have like 3 eyes or something, right? Who cares? So long as she has the body that will enable her to do what? Survive longer, have healthy children, feed those healthy children. Okay? There's a lot of milk there, right? I'm not trying to be crass here, I'm really not, okay? Just saying this woman is able to bear and feed children. Right? And if women are able to do that, or if they're able to tap into a fertility goddess who enables them to do that, then what are the results for their society, for their band of hunter-gatherers? It grows, or it at least repopulates every generation. Healthy children grow up to then take over the acts of hunting and gathering and to support their elders, who become elderly and frail and thus are unable to do those things anymore. So, a piece of evidence. We need context for this. And once we arrive at context, we can begin to form some opinions about what this all means. This is the process that we follow in this class. This is what it means to think historically. And this is a very different piece of evidence than much of the other stuff we will look at this semester, but we can do the same thing with it as we can with a written document or with a piece of architecture or, someone's trash from 5,000 years ago or whatever else we are interested in looking at. Any other questions or comments about the Venus of Illinois? All right. Now, hunter-gatherers were, contrary to perhaps modern misperceptions, wildly successful. Okay. Human beings managed to go from being really low on the food chain, okay. Very early human beings, or hominids, maybe we're not talking about Homo sapiens, we're talking about something earlier, Homo erectus, or maybe further back, even like the Australopithecines. In terms of where they ranked in the hierarchy, okay, they were third or fourth to eat. All right. So if an alpha predator, and human beings were not alpha predators, okay, but if an alpha predator like a lion killed something, a gazelle, hypothetically here, the lion ate first. In fact, not just the one lion, but all of the lions ate. And then the secondary carrion eaters moved in, like hyenas. And if there was anything else left, then the human beings fought with, other things for it. All right? But tell you what gave us the ability to leapfrog these things that were much higher on the food chain than we were? Yeah. Okay. The development of tools. Right, what you say here. Caroline. Well, fire in its own way is a tool, but that's a really good example of it, right? Yeah, harnessing fire is a tool because other animals often are very afraid of fire. Okay. So yeah, we developed tools. We figured out how to take things in nature. Now, other animals will do this, right? Other apes, for instance, will pick up a rock and bash something over the head with it. But what's the difference? What do they not do? Okay, yeah, human beings, and here we're going to start talking about Homo sapiens. Go back 250,000 years here. Homo sapiens figured out that if they just chipped away at a rock and made it have a little bit of an edge to it, it would be a more effective tool. Okay, and they could keep it, right? It's not grab a rock that's convenient and bash something in the head with it and throw it down. Right? Human beings decided, hey, this is really a useful thing. I'm going to take this with me. And I might even work at it and make it more effective. Right? Now, for a really long time, our tools, and I'm talking here about us collectively as a species, right? Our tools are really quite simple things. Chipped rocks that were roughly the size that would fit in the palm of your hand. Okay? In fact, for thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years, that was the basic tool. Further development when human beings started making what we call microliths. That is much smaller and more specialized and often sharper tools. Okay. And we became more and more effective over time as we did it. There's one other thing that gets perhaps even a bigger advantage in tools. What would that be? Well, it has to do with the brain. It's one of the products of having a good brain.
Being able to like process food, like does that turn it into?
Well, that's later. Okay, we're talking about the agricultural revolution. Well, but we're not the only ones with opposable thumbs. Okay. Yeah. Walking upright helps, but it's not a huge advantage. Actually, one of the best physical advantages we have in walking upright is we can run longer distances than most animals without getting overly fatigued. Okay. The fastest land animal over 1 mile is what? No, even a horse. Okay, a horse. The fastest over like a sprint is a cheetah. Fastest over 1 mile is a horse. The fastest over 50 miles is a human being. Okay, believe it or not. Now, I don't know. I don't think that running 50 miles would be something I'd want to do. Maybe some of you are into that sort of ultra marathon, right? But you know, human beings develop that capacity. That's an advantage, but it wasn't the big advantage. Yeah.
Critical thinking.
We're not quite there yet, though it may be part of that.
Being able to remember like what food is it poison?
Other animals can do that. They can do that.
Communication.
Yeah, this is it's really so obvious you might not even think about it. The ability to speak in complex ways. Other species can speak in a way, right? A monkey can give a cry that says danger, right? They might even have a couple of different cries about danger. One of them would be danger from below or danger from above. There may be some differentiation. But on the other hand, they cannot say, you might not want to step there because if you take one more step, that snake is going to bite your ankle and it's poisonous, and you probably have 15 minutes or so before you die. Right? There's a big difference between being able to say danger below and 2 more steps and you're dead, buddy. Right? Go that way, not that way. Okay? And so forth and so on. I mean, that's still fairly simple communication. Human beings figured out how to represent things in incredibly complex ways. Communication is huge. This is a massive revolution. About 50,000 years BC, where human beings jumped to the top of the food. Tools and speed. Okay. Now, the next huge revolution that completely changed the way human beings lived didn't come until about 10,000 years ago, and even then, not everywhere at once, right? It caught on eventually in just about every part of the world, but it happened piecemeal. And we call this either the Neolithic Revolution or the Agricultural Revolution. We need to also differentiate that into the pastoral/agricultural revolution, because they go hand in hand. So what is this thing? What is the Neolithic Revolution? What did human beings figure out how to do? To change their life. Go ahead. Well, yeah, it's agriculture. It's planting things purposefully in the ground with the intent of watching over them until they produce food and then harvesting it before any other creature can get to it. And keeping that food, right, gave to him.
I was going to say, maybe, you know, like that also means how to represent things.
Well, okay, and I mean, these are some of the outgrowths, right? So, this is the biggest revolution in humanity. The one we are currently in may surpass that. And I don't mean COVID, okay? We are currently part of a much longer term revolution, right? Called what? Or what am I talking about? Yeah. Industrial is pretty much done. Yeah, the technological revolution, which is changing everything about how human beings live. The society we have, and it's only starting to run its course. This may even change us biologically. We may evolve to be able to look at screens more effectively without hurting our necks. Elon Musk, anybody see the news about Elon Musk in the last few days? What's he done? Yeah, he has implanted some sort of chip into the interfaces with his brain directly. Right, he was experimenting. He hasn't done suicide. No, but he's interested in that. He would do that, right? If he felt like it was advanced enough. So yeah, we're making history, right? Or we are part of this mass revolution in human history that probably will happen more rapidly than the agricultural revolution did, and will change our lives even more fundamentally. It's already started. But let's go back to this earlier. Okay. There are two components to it. The human beings figured out that if we can harness the food-making capacity of plant life, in other words, they noticed that plants produce seeds. Well, the seeds happen to be, in most plants, the very thing that people want to eat, right? But they said, look, if we let's not eat all of it, because we can take this seed. This seems to be the life-germinating force here. Let's put these in the ground instead. That way, when we come back to this spot in our itinerant cycle, hunter-gatherers tend to follow specific routes, right, where they need food to be, then we'll see what happens. Okay, this was a wonderful, incredibly successful experiment that ended up revolutionizing human life. Now, the other part of this, remember, there are hunters and gatherers. Who do you think figured out farming? The gatherers. Which means what kind of people? Mostly women. Because of physical differences, speaking collectively and generally rather than individually, I'm sure there are many women, my wife included, who probably kick my ass, okay? Men, because of different physical capabilities, tended to do the hunting. Women tended to do the gathering. Almost certainly there were women who hunted and men who gathered, but generally speaking, that was the division. So women figured out agriculture. Men tended to chase after animals. But they noticed at some point that if they captured especially young animals, that those animals would become accustomed to human company and that they would actually be helpful. So we have the domestication of animals. What's the earliest animal to be domesticated? Yeah, well, the dog, from wolves, another species of canine. The dog. The dog has long been, for the last 15,000 years or so, the human being's best friend. I'm trying to use generational terms here. Not for, at least in most societies, for eating the dog, though there are some who do that, but rather as a companion, especially in hunting, and eventually in furring. Well, following the dog, a few thousand years later, came things like, well, the cow, and sheep, and goat, and chicken, and, well, cats. Are cats really domesticated animals? Do cats actually obey anything humans tell them to do or want them to do? All right. Even cat people, and I'm sure there are some in here, would have to admit that cats really aren't, trained by humans. Oh, sure, yeah, they give comfort, right, or something like that. They also need to do that to me. Okay? My family has 2 cats, all right? I mean, I'm not a cat hater necessarily, but I'm not a cat person. Cats are, well, they eat stuff. And sometimes they bring us gifts like that. So, nothing we want to eat though. Okay, we'll hunt ourselves. So. All right, they do keep lizards away and snakes. But yeah, humans figured out that if we don't have to chase after the food, we keep it with us, right? Maybe even raise it up to be larger and have more meat. That's all to the good. That's our advantage. To our advantage. And animals produce other byproducts like milk and fat for oil and things like this, right? And with chickens at least, eggs and ducks and other birds, right, produce eggs. So the herding revolution. Now, some human societies became mostly reliant on agriculture. Right? We call these sedentary agricultural societies. These are the ones that end up producing what we call civilization. They're the ones that reach a scale larger than other human societies. There are human societies that become almost entirely reliant on herding. Okay. There are specialized terms for this. We call them either pastoralists or nomads. Now, you have to be careful with this. Nomads does not mean hunter-gatherers. Nomads are herders. So don't confuse those two. And there are many human societies, even into fairly recent times, even still today in some areas, that are almost entirely reliant on their domesticated animals. So that is the basis of their economy, including some very important societies, some of which we will encounter throughout the semester. All right, let's talk about the consequences of this move to agriculture and pastoralism. What does this do? How does this change human society? Yeah.
People doesn't have to worry anymore about big everything needs more. They can diversify
Finish that thought. Diversify what?
their activities. They can do other things other than going out and home.
At least some people can. Right? Now, most of the people in these early agricultural societies, just as hunter-gatherers who devoted all their time to hunting, or I should say their productive time to hunting and gathering, people in these early agricultural societies, the vast majority of them spent most of their time in farming. Planting seeds, trying to keep pests away, harvesting, processing the food with things like this. Okay, what is this? Well, it's a early form of mortar and pestle. It's a grindstone. I don't think I would want to be reliant on a tool like this to turn my wheat berries or other millet or other grain into something my body can kind of process. All right, but it's better than just eating the raw wheat berries. The human body cannot assimilate that. Okay, so they had to figure out tools for processing things, tools for harvesting. Okay, here's a stone scythe. Again, I'm not sure I want to cut too many grain stalks with that thing, right? Your arm is likely to be very powered. But this is an innovation, nevertheless. It's a specialized innovation. Now, can everybody produce scythes with equal, or grindstones with equal effectiveness? Okay. So what can the person who's really good at making a scythe do with that skill? Yeah, he can say, or she can say, I don't want to farm anymore. Right? And so I'm just going to spend all my time making these things, and I'm going to trade the product of my labor, my specialized and skilled labor, for some of the produce that other people grow. Right? So specialization, diversification is one of the results of this. One of the major results. What are some other possible specializations? Yeah.
Building of houses.
Okay. Yeah. What besides craftsmanship or construction might one specialize? Well, that's most people. Okay, yeah. Yeah, potentially. Like, let's, someone who's just really good at instructing people on how to do certain things, right? Might be able to make their living that way. Yeah. Okay, yeah, maybe somebody figures out a way to keep track of things really effectively and they can hire themselves out to do that. Yes?
Maybe people that can actually make the food edible. Like you said, that they
Okay.
can grind it down.
Yeah, so they're really good at taking this process, or maybe they are better at processing it than others, right? So this is where millers come from, for instance, or bakers. Yeah, very good. Some others you might not think of. Yeah, go ahead.
Isn't this kind of like when government kind of started, or like hierarchy started?
Okay, well, some people might be really good at protecting the farmland that other societies might want to come in and take, especially if it's really fertile. So the warriors, especially, and those who lead men into battle, who also may function as a capable governor of some kind, a leader, not just of military things, but also a burgeoning government. There might be people in the society who, at least by the perception of most, are able to understand what the gods want. And so people can specialize as priests or priestesses. Yeah, or something like that, right? They might have, in addition to, being able to communicate with gods more effectively, they might have, medicinal knowledge or knowledge of herbs or whatever it is that allows them to heal, and they might, associate that with their religious capacities or their specializations.
Maybe people that know how to take care of animals and things.
Yeah, so the herbers, or those who construct stables and are able to keep, whatever domesticated animals in society. Especially if the society has, and this is somewhat later, they start to use horses or other swift animals for either transportation or eventually military needs. Right? Those become prized commodities, and the people who are effective at keeping the horses in good health and good order can specialize. So this move to agriculture creates a more complex and far more diversified society. Everybody's doing something, not everybody, but a lot of people doing different things that help the society function. But along with that come, and we've already alluded to this, come hierarchies. And this is not to say there weren't hierarchies with hunter-gatherers. Most hunter-gatherer bands have a chief or a religious leader, or maybe that's the same person has both of those roles. Okay? Or perhaps a few other positions that mean they outrank others. This tends to be on the basis of age more than anything else. And that's carried over into some of these new agricultural societies. But the hierarchies become far more complex. And this produces what we might, I think, by modern standards at least, call very negative kinds of institutions and circumstances. I don't want to judge these people historically necessarily, let's understand the context, right? We can see the origins of some of the inequalities that have animated human societies for a really, really long time. So which of all of these specializations do you suppose become most prized and are given pride of place in the agricultural society? The warriors. Warriors tended to be, by and large, what segment of the human population? There's roughly 50%. Which segment of the human population tended to become the warriors? Men. So whereas in hunter-gatherer societies there seems to have been, and this is a lot of extrapolation, right? But there seems to have been more of an egalitarian kind of situation where men and women shared responsibilities. Okay? Hunting and gathering were of roughly equal importance. If anything, gathering provided more food than hunting did. Okay? In these agricultural societies, women take a backseat. Women are, the place of women is angry. Women become subordinate. Now, this is not to say that some women were still not wildly successful and even important, right? Because they were, and we have some evidence of that. But the women who figured out farming and probably, given that fertility cults were the earliest, most of the earliest forms of religion, also were the originators of religion, now they give up those roles and become subordinate. This also leads to institutions because not all land is created equal. Anybody read Locke or Hobbes or any of these kind of early modern thinkers where they talk about the man in his natural state and all of this, right? Well, that is rubbish. It's hogwash. That never existed, okay? I mean, the supposition that, you know, if you apply, and I'm talking about Locke here, if you apply your labor to property, or to a piece of land, if you work on it, it becomes yours. Well, Locke never really deals with the fact that some land is better than other land, right? What makes a piece of land good for farming?
Soil composition, rainfall.
Or water source, if you don't have rain. If you got a river, like the Nile, even if you're in the middle of a desert, right, it's still going to produce food.
The seasons in the region, the elevation.
All of the first few especially. Okay. Soil composition and access to water. Well, how many nice pieces of land on a riverbank, really nice, good, fertile soil you can find? Well, eventually not enough to go around, right? So what's the result? Either war or trade. Okay? And sometimes both of them simultaneously. That a society or civilization is at war with another one does not preclude the fact that they might be trading with each other at the same time. It's like one modern example I like this one. At the beginning of the First World War, the British Army realized they desperately needed binoculars. Okay, because they knew that things like machine guns were important, and you need to be able to figure out where your bullets are landing from across the battlefields, and so they needed binoculars. This was essential. Well, the best companies in the world who made binoculars, the companies who made the best binoculars in the world, were German. So the British Army, now, England and Germany happen to be at war with each other, right? But the British Army, the British government reached out to this German company, and they said, we want to put in a massive order for binoculars. And they negotiated a price that was quite favorable to the German firm, and the German firm decided that they were going to cancel the order that had been placed by the German army so that they could fill the order for the British army, because the British wanted to pay them. So this often runs counter to what you might think is actually happening. So trade and warfare. This is how we solve the problem, or at least get around the problem of not having enough access to good land. We go take it from somebody else, or we trade for the things they grow on that land with stuff we might be able to produce on the land we have. Because our land might be really good at growing, I don't know, carrots, and theirs might be really good at growing wheat, and They get sick of eating wheat, they want carrots, and we need the wheat, and so we trade. But what are the results of warfare? Okay, this limits the population. Yeah. What did you say?
Oh, I was going to say creation of what?
Well, there's more tools, right? In this case, tools that make one a better warrior, a fighter. Swords, armor, okay. Artillery weapons of various kinds, project somebody else. And a lot of effort is, eventually put into the making of weapons. But another result is, well, if one society conquers the other, what are they going to do with the human population they've just conquered? By and large, in the ancient world at least, they enslaved. They kill those without mercy who present a continued threat, and they enslave the rest. So things like slavery and, you might have used the word genocide, become part of human. There are some other negatives, and negatives of different sorts to this revolution. Some of you may even suffer the results of these things, these choices that human beings made 10,000 years ago. Is anybody lactose intolerant here? Anybody have celiac or gluten intolerant? Well, these are actually the results. Some diseases like this, okay, or conditions, disorders like this, are the result of the human body's inability to process the foods that, because of the agricultural and pastoral revolutions, we become reliant on. Not everybody does well with cow's milk. It becomes the dominant form of milk in most societies. Cows produce more milk than any other creature. Or, especially, grain products. It's just human beings in general don't handle these things well. Even if you're fine eating lots and lots of bread, chances are you have physical repercussions from eating an overabundance of grain products of one kind or another. Some of them embarrassing. So, that's health-wise. The agricultural revolution did not necessarily do us any favors. The other thing, and this is counterintuitive. Okay. Who do you suppose works harder and longer? A hunter-gatherer who has to chase down their food and walk around until they find roots and berries, or an agriculturalist / pastoralist who has the animals already there and the grain fields already there, the granaries. The farmers work exponentially more. Typical hunter-gatherer, and this comes from studies that were done of hunter-gatherer societies that persisted into the 20th century. Typical hunter-gatherer works a 10 to 15-hour work week. Now that work is hard, right? Chasing down an antelope or a giraffe or something like that is difficult and potentially dangerous. But once they bring down that antelope or that giraffe, then what? They got food for a while. Hunter-gatherer societies tend to be quite small, maybe 50 or 100 people. Okay. And an antelope's likely going to feed them for several days. During which time, they don't even work. And since they don't have any method of preserving that food, they got to eat it then. Right? And once that's gone, they go find the next animal. If they find a little cache of roots or a bunch of berry bushes, well, they can stay put for a while. Especially if they know the lore. They know which things are good for food. Even potentially emergency foods, things that don't necessarily taste good or are less desirable, but will get you by when it comes to having profits. Farming is hard work. So not only are we less healthy as a result of this move, we also work a lot harder than we did in underground. So does anybody want to take a time machine back 10,000 years and tell these early farmers to stop it? You're cursing us. Well, some have suggested that might be a desirable thing to do, but we realize a lot of things we do that. So this is an important revolution, maybe the key revolution in human history. Now, the results of this revolution, there are a lot of other consequences we could get into, but I think that you get the point. Okay. The result ultimately is that these early agricultural societies are able to grow and reach a scale and a complexity that was unimaginable for hunter-gatherers. In fact, impossible, we might even say. Yes, hunter-gatherers had a lot of time on their hands. They filled it with things like storytelling and music and dance and art. Right? We saw a piece of art from hunter-gatherers today. You may have seen cave paintings or other forms of hunter-gatherer art. Some of this is pretty interesting, pretty sophisticated. There's a really wonderful documentary made about 10 years ago or so by the German filmmaker Werner Herzog called The Cave of Forgotten Dreams. Highly recommend watching it. It's about Chauby Cave in southern France, which was only discovered, these are cave paintings only discovered about 20, 25 years ago. I mean, and they were because there had been a cave-in, the entrance to the cave had been sealed for a really long time. These things are preserved almost to the point where they're unchanged from the time they were painted. So highly recommend watching that. I might even be tempted to offer extra credit if you watch that and write up some reaction. I need to be careful how many of these opportunities I do. But yeah, I'll go ahead and make that up. Okay. Anyway, and if you come up with something like that, if you're interested in exploring something further, feel free to make me a proposition, so to speak. Right? If I do this, if I go this extra mile, right, and you give me some extra credit, I might be amenable. But when societies reach a certain scale and complexity, we start to call them civilizations. And for our purposes here, we're going to look at two early agricultural civilizations. There are a few others that come into existence around the same time, within 1,000 or so years of each other. All right. We're not going to talk, for instance, about the civilizations of the Indus Valley in South Asia, with Pakistan, actually. But by 3000 BCE or so, the city of Mohenjo-Daro probably had 150, 200,000 people. One city, 5,000 years ago. That's nothing short of remarkable. We're not going to talk about the Olmecs in Central America, who also had a highly developed complex civilization. We are going to talk about Mesopotamia, or more broadly, the Fertile Crescent. And now, if you're studying geography, you know exactly what we're looking at. You would know that, for instance, this is the Eastern Mediterranean. You can read at the very least, right? And so the Fertile Crescent, called so because of its shape, runs from the Persian Gulf up these two rivers, the Tigris to the east and the Euphrates to the west, into this mountainous region up here called the Caucasus, and then down the Mediterranean coast, this area called the Levant. That's also a term on here. Not including Anatolia, which is this peninsula up here that's now called Turkey. Okay, that's also a term on your sheet, right? You know these things. But the Fertile Crescent. Okay. This was the site of one of the earliest human civilizations. The other one is Egypt, and I'll get into that in a minute. So we're going to spend a little time on these two. Now, from your reading in the textbook, from things you already may know, what kind of civilization was ancient Mesopotamia? What are some of the key features of it? Any comments?
They developed garments, and obviously that gave them ability to trade and grow, expand.
Yeah, I mean, this is an area that, especially in the ancient world, was able to produce a large quantity of agricultural goods. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this whole area is colloquially called the cradle of civilization. They did go to war, right? Why? Well, these rivers make it very easy to travel. Okay, up and down. Now, the rivers in some places are quite swift. Sometimes they flood, there are problems, but rivers, by and large, make transportation very both of human beings and of goods. But there are not a lot of natural barriers here. And so, as it developed, the ancient Mesopotamian society did not lend itself for a variety of reasons. Some of it is the linguistic complexity of the area. Lots of different languages spoken, thus people couldn't necessarily communicate with each other. Okay? But it lends itself to the development of what we call city-states. That is a major population center surrounded by fertile farmland, the two reliant on each other. Symbiotic relationship between the farmland and the city. Right? In the 24th century BCE, there was a conqueror named Sargon, who conquered all of lower Mesopotamia here, right, from the Persian Gulf up to roughly this area where the two rivers nearly come together, right, where Akkad is, okay? Hence Akkadian, by the way, if you're wondering about that adjective. Okay, so this was the empire of Sargon, but it lasted only about 50 years. About 5 or 6 centuries later, there was a guy named Hammurabi from Babylon, another of the city-states, who ended up conquering all of Mesopotamia and even over into other parts of the Fertile Crescent. But his empire, too, only lasted for about a century. Otherwise, this place had city-states that were rivals of each other. Okay. Constantly at war, also constantly trading with each other. Other features of Mesopotamia.
They learned to melt and smelt copper, bronze, and metal.
Good. So metals become important. The era from about 3000 BCE to about 1000 BCE is called the Bronze Age. Right? Because that becomes the dominant medium, the material, for making tools. And in fact, for producing art, right? Bronze sculpture becomes the art form du jour. Right? We'll get into the Iron Age after, okay? But they moved from using stone as the most popular medium for tools and things to using bronze. Right? And that happens here, it happens in both places. Anything else about Mesopotamia that you learned or important? We're missing one of the most essential characteristics.
How many religious figures
Okay, yes. A pantheon of deities. Right? Though every one of the city-states had a patron god or goddess, these tended to look like the other patron gods and goddesses of the other cities. They had similar characteristics. So the city god of Babylon, for instance, was called Marduk. Marduk was their chief deity, but they did have gods and goddesses they shared in common with other city-states, maybe even called them by the same names, depending on the closeness of their languages linguistically. And the city god of Babylon probably looked a whole lot like the city god of Akkad or Kish or any. Yes? They did produce riot, and that's important. Well, what kind of rivers are these? You don't say they have water in them. Yes, they do. Yeah, but yeah, most rivers are. Well, that's all. Pretty much all rivers are, unless they have a high salt content. They did, and this is really important for understanding each other. These rivers are fed by snowfall that happens in the Caucasus Mountains to the north. Now, this is how old you guys are. The Winter Olympics in the year 2014, and you guys are all from like, well, some of you are from the north, right? But maybe you don't even care about the Winter Olympics. Anyway, the Winter Olympics in 2014 took place in the Caucasus Mountains, in Sochi, in what is now Russia. And one of the things that I remember most about those games was that they had problems with the weather. Right? This took place in February, but temperatures, even in those mountains in February, at times reached like 60 degrees. And so, you know, the slalom ski event took place in a rainstorm. Imagine, and I come from the Rocky Mountains, but I did not grow up skiing. I'm sort of ashamed of that. I did water ski, I did not snow. Anyway, I cannot imagine even trying to stay up on skis, much less do it in a rainstorm, right, where the snow becomes slush. Okay. I remember the half-pipe competition too, like the American Shaun White was a two-time reigning champion, and he was a huge favorite in this thing, but then like the night before the competition, it rained, and the half-pipe was a mess, and he had a bad few runs and placed fourth, right, and the American was pissed off about it. Flying tomato, they call it. He came back and won the Canadian, right? He got his but that's actually indicative of something that's really important in the story. Okay? The weather in the Caucasus is unpredictable. Right? There might be a huge snowfall followed by a sudden melt, and then what happens to the rivers? Yeah, a raging flood comes down the river, and there's the other factor here is, especially the Euphrates, in places has natural levees, meaning the river sits above much of the surrounding farmland and has these earthen levees that it's built up over time. Well, if you get a flood, earthen levees don't do a very good job holding the water in. And you saw this in New Orleans 15 years ago with Hurricane Katrina. Actually, that was 15 years ago yesterday. Most of you probably remember that, but I remember quite and, you know, the whole city was flooded. Well, they probably felt like these Mesopotamians did on a frequent basis. So, if the environment is hostile, which it was, and the other human societies are threatening, what are the cultural results of that? In other words, how do you think the Mesopotamians imagined or envisioned or thought about the world around them? Danger, absolutely.
Yes, the same way that we Americans do that. Everyone's against us.
Right. COVID changed everything. We're getting a little taste of what ancient Mesopotamians probably felt on a frequent basis. Yeah. Nature was threatening. The world was a scary place. We're talking about an entire civilization that probably suffered from PTSD. Okay, and I actually do not mean to be funny about it. It's a deadly serious thing. What were the Mesopotamian gods and goddesses? This is a good piece of evidence. Yeah. They were angry and vengeful. Okay? Even the afterlife, right? Even like the Mesopotamian version of what the Judeo-Christian tradition, when it comes to call heaven, was not a nice place. Okay, a place where people went to suffer. Even people who had been good, okay, went to suffer and like eat dust the rest of their existence, and the gods presided over it, laughing at these pathetic creatures that they. The gods themselves were constantly at war with each other, and that warfare and animosity spilled over into human society. Consequences were great. So we're talking here about a pessimistic, gloomy civilization. On the other hand, this is a civilization that was forced to innovate. If you live in a hostile environment and you want to survive, you got to figure it out. And the Mesopotamians did. Okay. One of the best examples of this adaptability is their irrigation system. They figured out that if they dug canals, they could spread the fresh water further and further from the rivers and produce more crops. They also figured out if they had runoff channels, they could divert the flood down into an area that was less destructive than if it hit a town or the best farm. And so they created these runoff channels and sluice gates and things that enabled them to divert flows. It didn't always work, but it often did, right? Innovation. They had to innovate militarily because they were always at war with each other. And so they came up with more and more effective weapons and strategies and tactics on the battlefield. Right? Mesopotamians, not coincidentally, were the first to produce swift animals, or I should say, use swift animals like horses in warfare. They had the first cavalry, and that's only one piece of that. Now, compare Mesopotamia to a neighboring civilization, Egypt. This is a satellite image of Egypt. And you can see this lush green ribbon that fans out when it approaches the Mediterranean Sea. It's not hard to see where the Nile River goes. You can see it from space. The Nile River could not be more different than the Euphrates if you drew up plans for it before you put it into place. Assuming you're God or whoever put all this nature. The Nile was a very different kind of river. Thus, and the Egyptian environmental and geographic circumstances were vastly different than those in Mesopotamia. Thus, the civilization is vastly different. Okay, we are out of time. At the beginning of class next time, we will have the geography quiz. That will take us about 15 minutes. Remember, there are 25 questions. You know it or you don't, okay? So about 15 minutes, and then we will dive into talking about Egypt and continuing the conversation.
Have a good day.
You too.